My name is Brittany Johnson, and at 32 years old, I never expected to be faced with the impossible choice between burying my father and saving my career. Dad was the one who taught me to code when I was just 10, sitting side by side at our old desktop computer. When the call came at midnight that his heart had given out, my world shattered. But nothing prepared me for what my boss in HR would say the next morning, when I requested 4 days off to lay him to rest. Their response changed everything, and what I did next would impact millions. Before I tell you how I turned my grief into the most consequential decision of my career, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, this journey from heartbreak to justice is one you'll want to follow. I grew up in a modest neighborhood in Seattle, where the constant rain provided the perfect backdrop for indoor activities like coding. Our house was small, but filled with books, technology, and love. My father, Robert Johnson, worked as a computer systems analyst for a local company. He wasn't famous or wealthy, but in my eyes he was a genius who could make computers do whatever he wanted. Every Sunday evening without fail, Dad and I would have our weekly call. Even after I moved out and started building my own life, this tradition remained sacred. We would talk about everything from the latest tech innovations to personal challenges. He always ended our calls the same way. Remember, Brittany, your mind is your greatest asset, but your integrity is your greatest power. Those words shaped my entire career path. After graduating with honors in computer science from the University of Washington, I landed a competitive internship at CyberCore Solutions, a rapidly growing tech company specializing in database management systems. What started as a 3-month internship blossomed into a thriving career. Within 6 years, I climbed from junior developer to senior software engineer, becoming one of the youngest team leaders in company history. My role at CyberCore wasn't just important, it was critical. I managed our most valuable client database systems, each worth millions in annual contracts. The systems I built weren't just efficient, they were revolutionary, reducing processing time by 70% and saving our clients countless hours and dollars. My code became the backbone of the company's most profitable products. Being the only female senior engineer brought its own set of challenges. I navigated the subtle biases, the occasional mansplaining, and the persistent need to prove myself again and again. In meetings, my ideas were sometimes overlooked until a male colleague repeated them. But rather than becoming bitter, I became better using my unique perspective to identify solutions others missed. When I first joined CyberCore, the culture was collaborative and supportive. The original founder, Thomas Sullivan, believed in work-life balance and often reminded us that happy engineers write better code. Team lunches, flexible hours, and genuine appreciation for personal milestones were standard practice. I felt valued not just as an employee, but as a human being. Everything changed when Sullivan sold the company to CoreTech Industries 3 years ago. The new management, led by CEO Richard Peterson and my direct boss, Marcus Fleming, brought a cutthroat culture focused solely on metrics and deliverables. Vacation days became harder to approve, sick days were met with suspicion, and 18-hour workdays became the unspoken expectation rather than the exception. Despite the deteriorating environment, I remained committed to my work. Just last month, I single-handedly saved our relationship with Westfield Financial, a client worth $3.8 million annually. Their system was on the verge of catastrophic failure due to an oversight by one of Marcus's favorite male engineers. While everyone panicked during the emergency weekend meeting, I quietly identified the issue and worked 36 hours straight to implement a solution. No one offered to help, but everyone was quick to celebrate when the crisis was averted. What my colleagues and especially management didn't fully appreciate was my unique position within the company. Through years of dedicated work and problem-solving, I had become the sole keeper of crucial proprietary code. I was the only one who understood the intricate architecture of our most valuable systems, and I alone held all the access credentials for our top-tier client databases. This wasn't by design or corporate malfeasance. It was simply the natural evolution of being the person who consistently solved the hardest problems. My father had been especially proud of my recent achievement with Westfield Financial. During our last Sunday call just 3 days before his death, he listened intently as I described the technical details of the save. "That's my girl," he said, his voice warm with pride. "You've always had a gift for seeing patterns others miss." "It's just pattern recognition, Dad," I replied modestly. "You taught me that when I was 12. "No, sweetheart. What you have is more than just technical skill. You have intuition and heart. That's why you're invaluable to them, even if they don't always show it. Those would be the last words of career advice my father ever gave me. Little did I know how prophetic they would prove to be, and how soon I would need to remember them. That final Sunday call ended like all the others, with plans for the next week, and his standard, "Love you, Brit. Keep changing the world one line of code at a time." It was ordinary and perfect, with no indication that our lifetime of conversations was about to end. If I had known it would be our last talk, would I have said something more profound? Probably not. Our relationship didn't need grand declarations. It was built on consistency, mutual respect, and the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other completely. That was the gift my father gave me, a model of what genuine support looked like. A model I would soon realize was entirely absent from my professional life. The call came at 11:42 on Wednesday night. I remember checking the time because late-night calls are never good news. My mother's voice was barely recognizable, broken by sobs and desperation. "Brittany, it's Dad." He collapsed in the kitchen. The ambulance came, but they couldn't. She couldn't finish the sentence. My body went cold. "Mom, which hospital? I'm coming right now." "Swedish Medical Center. Please hurry." I don't remember the drive. I only remember running through the emergency room doors, still wearing my pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt, my hair unbrushed and heart pounding. A nurse directed me to a small waiting room where my mother sat alone, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. "Mom." She looked up, her eyes red and vacant. He was gone before they even got him in the ambulance. A massive heart attack, they said. It was so fast. The words didn't make sense. Dad was only 62. He had just had a checkup 3 months ago. He went hiking every weekend. He watched his diet. He did everything right. How could he just be gone? I sat beside my mother and took her hand, which felt cold and fragile in mine. We sat in silence for what seemed like hours before a doctor came to explain what had happened. Acute myocardial infarction. Immediate cardiac arrest. Minimal suffering. Clinical terms that did nothing to fill the sudden void in our lives. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and arrangements. My younger brother Ryan flew in from Portland. My Aunt Susan arrived from Tacoma to help my mother, who seemed to crumble a little more with each passing hour. By dawn, our family home was filled with relatives, all moving through the motions of grief, while I operated on autopilot. "We need to decide on funeral arrangements," Aunt Susan said gently around 9 in the morning. "Your mother isn't in any state to handle the details." I nodded, suddenly aware of the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Dad had always handled the practical aspects of family life. Now that fell to me. The funeral home could accommodate us on Saturday, 4 days away. We chose a simple but dignified service, followed by burial, in the small cemetery where my grandparents rested. There would be a reception afterward at my parents' house. All of this would require my presence and coordination, not to mention the emotional support my mother desperately needed. As the reality of the situation sank in, I realized I would need time off work, something I rarely requested. 4 days seemed like the minimum, Thursday and Friday to handle arrangements and support my family, Saturday for the funeral itself, and Sunday to begin processing before returning to work on Monday. At midnight, after finally getting my mother to sleep and ensuring my brother and aunt had comfortable places to stay, I sat down at my laptop and composed an email to my boss Marcus, copying the HR department. "Due to the sudden death of my father, I need to take emergency bereavement leave from Thursday through Sunday. I will return to the office on Monday. I've documented all current projects and set up automated monitoring for the Westfield system. Please contact me via cell for any emergencies." Professional, concise, reasonable. I hit send and immediately received an automated out-of-office reply from Marcus, stating he would review emails in the morning. Several team members, however, were still online despite the late hour. Within minutes, messages of condolence filled my inbox. "So sorry for your loss, Brittany. Take all the time you need. Don't worry about anything here. We've got it covered. My deepest sympathies. Family comes first." Their kindness brought the first tears I had allowed myself since receiving the news. In the shock of loss, I had maintained composure for my mother's sake, but now, alone in my childhood bedroom, the reality began to hit. Dad was gone. The person who had guided me believed in me, and understood me better than anyone, was never coming back. I cried until there were no tears left, then fell into a restless sleep, clutching my phone in case the hospital called with some miraculous news that it had all been a mistake. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through curtains I had picked out as a teenager. After checking on my mother and confirming that Aunt Susan would stay with her, I showered and dressed in professional attire, preparing to stop by the office to formally request my leave and collect anything I might need to work remotely if absolutely necessary. I wanted to be responsible to handle this loss without dropping any of my professional obligations. As I was about to leave, my phone buzzed with an email notification from Marcus. My heart sank as I read his cold response. "Brittany, please come to the office for an urgent meeting regarding your request. 9:00 a.m. conference room. B. Joanna from HR will be present." A meeting. For a standard bereavement leave request. Something felt wrong, but I dismissed it as paranoia born from grief and exhaustion. Surely any decent employer would understand the need for a few days to bury one's father. I had no idea that this meeting would become the catalyst for a decision that would change the course of my career and ultimately the culture of an entire company. Conference Room B was the smallest meeting space at Cybercore, typically used for performance reviews and disciplinary actions. When I arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, Marcus Fleming was already seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable behind his designer glasses. Beside him sat Joanna Perkins from Human Resources, primly dressed, with a leather portfolio open before her. "Brittany, thank you for coming in during this difficult time," Joanna said, her voice carrying all the warmth of an automated customer service message. "Please have a seat." I sat down, placing my father's obituary draft on the table. "I appreciate you meeting with me promptly. I need to finalize the funeral arrangements this morning." Marcus cleared his throat, straightening his already impeccable tie. "Brittany, we've reviewed your request for 4 days of bereavement leave, and we need to discuss some concerns." "Concerns," I repeated, confusion momentarily overshadowing my grief. "Yes," Joanna interjected. "As you know, the Westfield presentation is scheduled for this Friday, and the system implementation is due Monday morning. Your presence is critical for both milestones." I blinked, trying to process what she was implying. "I understand the timing is unfortunate, but my father died last night. The funeral is on Saturday." Marcus leaned forward, his fingers forming a steeple under his chin. "No one is questioning the seriousness of your loss, Brittany, but you need to understand that you are irreplaceable for this project. The entire Westfield account depends on your presentation." "Surely someone else on the team can handle the presentation," I suggested. "I've documented everything thoroughly, and Jason has been my backup on this project from the beginning." Marcus shook his head. "Jason doesn't have your comprehensive understanding of the system. Westfield specifically requested you after the save you pulled off last month. They trust you." I could join virtually for part of the presentation I offered already, hating myself for even suggesting a compromise during what should be a time of mourning. I could call in from the funeral home during breaks in the arrangements. Joanna consulted her notes. "Our company policy actually specifies that bereavement leave for immediate family is limited to 2 days, not 4. She slid a printed copy of the employee handbook toward me, a paragraph highlighted in yellow. "You're welcome to take Thursday and Friday, but we'll need you back in the office for remote support over the weekend to prepare for Monday's implementation." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You want me to work on the day of my father's funeral?" "We understand it's not ideal," Marcus said, having the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "But business necessities sometimes require personal sacrifices. The timing of the Westfield contract renewal is contractually fixed." "I saved that contract," I reminded him quietly. "I worked 36 hours straight without sleep to fix a problem I didn't create." "And the company recognizes your contribution," Joanna said smoothly. "Which is precisely why your expertise is indispensable now." Marcus nodded. "Look, Brittany, we're trying to be reasonable here. The company is willing to allow you Thursday and Friday, but we need you online Saturday afternoon and in the office on Sunday to prepare for Monday's implementation. That's our best offer. And if I need all 4 days to bury my father and support my mother who can barely function right now." Joanna's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Then you'll need to choose between your work commitments and your family obligations. I should caution that such a choice could impact your standing in the company and future advancement opportunities." The threat wasn't even veiled. In that moment, something cold and clarifying washed over me. I thought of my father, who had taught me that true success was never achieved by sacrificing your humanity. Let me make sure I understand, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You're asking me to either miss parts of my father's funeral or face professional consequences. Is that correct? We're asking you to fulfill your professional obligations during a critical business juncture, Marcus replied. The company has invested millions in your projects and depends on your expertise. Surely your father would have understood the importance of professional responsibility. The mention of my father from his lips felt like a desecration. Marcus had never met. My dad had no right to speculate what he would have wanted. The bereavement policy is standard across the industry, Joanna added. 2 days is actually quite generous compared to some companies that offer only 1 day for immediate family. I looked down at the obituary I had stayed up late, writing, detailing my father's life of kindness, integrity, and unwavering support for his family. Then I looked up at these two people who saw me not as a grieving daughter, but as a resource to be managed and exploited. I see, I said, simply gathering my papers. Is there anything else we need to discuss? Marcus seemed slightly thrown by my calm reaction. Just confirm which days you'll be taking so we can adjust the schedule accordingly. I stood up, tucking the obituary back into my bag. I'll need some time to consider my options. We'll need your decision by noon, Joanna said. The team needs to prepare either way. I nodded once and walked out without another word, my mind already racing with possibilities I had never before considered. As I returned to my desk, I noticed several sympathetic glances from colleagues who had obviously heard about my loss. They had no idea that I had just experienced a second different kind of death, the death of any loyalty or dedication I had ever felt towards Cybercore Solutions. Sitting at my desk, I stared at my computer screen without really seeing it. The company logo pulsed in the corner of my monitor, a symbol that once filled me with pride but now seemed hollow and predatory. Around me, the office hummed with activity. Everyone focused on their screens, their deadlines, their tasks. How many of them would be treated the same way if tragedy struck? How many already had been? My father's voice echoed in my mind. Never let anyone devalue your humanity, Brittany. The moment they see you as a function rather than a person is the moment you need to reassess. He had told me this when I was 16 after a summer job where my manager had scheduled me to work despite a 102-degree fever. Dad had marched down to the ice cream shop where I worked and pulled me out mid-shift, telling the manager that his daughter wasn't a machine. It was the only time I ever saw my gentle father truly angry. Now, 15 years later, history was repeating itself. But Dad wasn't here to advocate for me. I had to do it myself. I opened my project files and began a systematic inventory of exactly what I controlled at Cybercore. The Westfield financial system was only the tip of the iceberg. Over the years, I had built or substantially modified 13 major client systems, each generating between $1 and $4 million in annual revenue. The proprietary algorithm I had developed for data migration had become the company's most marketable feature, but only I fully understood how it worked. Due to the company's haphazard documentation practices and my own specialized knowledge, I held the keys to systems worth approximately $47 million in annual revenue. The $3.8 million Westfield account Marcus and Joanna were so concerned about represented less than 10% of what I actually controlled. More importantly, I realized how casually the company had overlooked basic security protocols in their rush to deliver products. All access credentials, backdoor passwords, and system architecture details existed primarily in my head or in my personal documentation. No formal knowledge transfer had ever been enforced. They had taken my dedication for granted, assuming I would always be available, always be loyal, always put the company first, even above my own family's needs. My phone buzzed with messages of condolence from colleagues. Amanda from accounting. So sorry about your dad. Take all the time you need. Tyler from testing. We've got your back. Family comes first. Even Jason, my nominal backup, wrote, This company would fall apart without you, but some things are more important. Be with your family. Their kindness stood in stark contrast to management's cold calculation. These people, my actual team, understood what Marcus and Joanna did, not that employees are humans' first, resources second. I made a decision then, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. I would protect myself, honor my father, and perhaps even catalyze needed change within Cybercore. First, I created a secure cloud repository outside the company network. Then, methodically and carefully, I began backing up all my work, all my code, all my documentation. This wasn't company theft, I reasoned. This was insurance protection against the very real possibility that they would restrict my access the moment I defied their demands. Next, I documented all instances of workplace policy violations I had witnessed or experienced: the unpaid overtime, the denied vacation requests, the instances of subtle discrimination. I forwarded key emails to my personal account, including the conversation about bereavement leave. The Westfield project files were particularly important. I had created that system almost entirely on my own, often working weekends and evenings without additional compensation. I carefully transferred all files, documentation, and access credentials to my secure repository, ensuring that I alone would have access. As I worked, I reviewed my employment contract, paying special attention to the intellectual property clauses. Like most tech workers, I had signed agreements giving Cybercore ownership of anything I created on company time. However, the contract also specified that the company was obligated to maintain reasonable working conditions and standard industry benefits. Their denial of basic bereavement leave arguably violated this clause. By 5 o'clock, as colleagues began to leave for the day, offering awkward condolences as they passed my desk, I had completed my preparations. I had secured my work, documented company violations, and created a detailed inventory of my contributions and unique knowledge. The last task was the hardest: writing my resignation letter. I kept it professional and brief. Please accept this letter as formal notification that I am resigning from my position as Senior Software Engineer with Cybercore Solutions, effective immediately. Due to the company's inability to accommodate appropriate bereavement leave following my father's death, I find myself unable to continue my employment under the current management structure. I will be available to discuss the transition of my projects after my father's funeral and a reasonable grieving period. I printed one copy and placed it in an envelope addressed to Marcus. Then I packed up my personal belongings, few as they were, into my laptop bag. As a final measure, I created several security protocols within the systems I had built, not to damage anything, but to ensure that only I could navigate certain critical functions. It wasn't sabotage, just a guarantee that I would have leverage if needed. As I prepared to leave, I looked around the office where I had spent countless hours of my life. The place that had once felt like a second home now seemed foreign and cold. My desk, always meticulously organized, was now completely clear, except for the company-owned laptop and monitor. I sent one final email to myself, attaching key documentation that proved my value to the company, then cleared my browser history, logged out of all systems, and shut down the computer. Walking out of the building that evening, I felt a strange mixture of grief, anxiety, and liberation. I had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time since joining Cybercore, I felt fully in control of my own fate. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms, not theirs. My father had taught me that integrity sometimes means making difficult choices. As I drove to my mother's house to continue funeral arrangements, I knew he would have approved of my decision. Some things are simply more important than any job, any company, or any amount of money. Family is one of them. Self-respect is another. After leaving the office, I drove directly to my parents' house. The weight of the day's event sat heavily on my shoulders, but alongside the grief was a newfound sense of purpose. My mother was in the kitchen with Aunt Susan when I arrived, trying to keep busy by preparing food for relatives who would be arriving the next day. "How did it go at work, honey?" Mom asked her, eyes still red but her voice steadier than before. I decided to spare her the details. They've been informed about Dad. I'm taking the time we need to honor him properly. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at my father's old desk in his home office, surrounded by his books and the family photos he treasured. The space still smelled faintly of his aftershave. Using my laptop, I executed the final phase of my plan. First, I set up automatic email responses from my personal account to anyone from Cybercore, directing all communication to go through my newly created legal email address. Next, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in employment law, briefly explaining my situation and requesting an urgent consultation. Finally, I created a comprehensive document detailing all my contributions to Cybercore, the systems I had built, and my unique knowledge that the company relied upon. This wasn't for negotiation purposes, but to ensure I had a clear record of my value in case legal issues arose. The most critical action was confirming that my secure repository, containing the Westfield project, was properly protected. I implemented additional security measures, ensuring that only I could access the files. This $3.8 million project that had been deemed so important that I couldn't even attend my father's funeral was now safely under my sole control. With these actions completed, I closed my laptop and allowed myself to fully feel the emotional impact of the past 24 hours. My father was gone. My career at Cybercore was over. Yet somehow, amidst all this loss, I had found clarity and strength I didn't know I possessed. The next morning was dedicated to finalizing funeral arrangements. We selected readings, chose music that Dad loved, and I wrote a eulogy that I hoped would capture his essence. Throughout the day, relatives arrived from across the country, each bringing stories about my father that made us laugh and cry in equal measure. My phone began buzzing around 10:30 in the morning. Marcus calling. I let it go to voicemail. Then Joanna from HR. Ignored. Then the chief technology officer who had rarely spoken to me directly before. Another call from Marcus. Text messages asking where I was. Emails marked urgent filling my inbox. By noon, the panic from Cybercore was palpable. Someone had clearly tried to access the Westfield files and discovered they couldn't navigate the security protocols I had implemented. My absence had been noted, my resignation letter found. At 2 o'clock, while discussing flower arrangements with the funeral director, I received a call from Richard Peterson, the CEO himself. I excused myself and took the call in the funeral home's quiet room. Brittany, this is Richard Peterson. We have a situation that needs your immediate attention. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. I'm currently at the funeral home arranging my father's service, Mr. Peterson. A pause. Yes, and I want to express my sincere condolences. However, we've discovered some irregularities with the Westfield system, and the team can't proceed without your input. That's unfortunate timing, I replied calmly. As I explained in my resignation letter, I'm not available until after my father's funeral and a reasonable grieving period. Resignation. His surprise sounded genuine. Marcus mentioned you were taking bereavement leave. I wasn't aware of any resignation. Interesting. Marcus hadn't shared that detail with his boss yet. Mr. Peterson, I resigned yesterday after being told I needed to choose between attending my father's funeral and keeping my job. Another longer pause. That doesn't sound like our company policy. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. Joanna from HR was quite clear about the company's position. I have the meeting documented. The CEO's tone shifted from authoritative to conciliatory. Brittany, whatever happened in that meeting, I'm sure we can work something out. The Westfield account is critically important, and you're a valued member of our team. I was a valued member until I needed 4 days to bury my father. Now I'm a former employee, attending to family matters. I'll be available to discuss transition plans next week. The Westfield presentation is tomorrow, he reminded me, an edge creeping into his voice, and we seem to be having trouble accessing some of the files. That's unfortunate timing, I repeated. His voice hardened. Brittany, removing company files and implementing unauthorized security measures could have serious legal consequences. So could violating employment contracts by creating a hostile work environment and denying reasonable bereavement leave. My lawyer would be happy to discuss those issues with your legal team. The mention of lawyers changed his approach immediately. Let's not escalate this unnecessarily. What would it take to get your assistance with the Westfield situation? We're prepared to offer appropriate compensation for consulting services. I'm burying my father on Saturday, Mr. Peterson. No amount of money will change that priority. I'll contact you next week to arrange the transfer of necessary information. Before he could respond, I ended the call and turned off my phone. The family needed me present, not distracted by corporate drama. The funeral on Saturday was beautiful in its simplicity. The small church was filled beyond capacity, a testament to how many lives my father had touched. I delivered the eulogy with as much strength as I could muster, focusing on Dad's kindness, his integrity, and his unwavering support for everyone he loved. My father taught me that success isn't measured by titles or salaries, I said, looking out at the gathered mourners. It's measured by how you treat others, especially in difficult moments. It's about standing up for what's right even when it costs you something. These are lessons I'll carry forever. Throughout the service and the burial that followed, my phone remained off. This day belonged to my father and our family, not to Cybercore's crisis. Only later at the reception at my parents' house did I briefly check my messages. 27 missed calls, 42 urgent emails. The company was in full panic mode. The Westfield presentation had been postponed as they couldn't access the complete system. The client was unhappy. The executive team was in emergency meetings. I put my phone away and rejoined my family. Tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with the aftermath. Today was for grief, for memory, and for honoring the man who had taught me that some principles are worth standing up for no matter the cost. On Monday morning, 5 days after my father's death, I met with Catherine Barnes, the employment attorney I had retained. Her office was warm and professional, a stark contrast to the cold conference room where Marcus and Joanna had delivered their ultimatum the week before. Based on the documentation you've provided, Catherine said, reviewing my files, Cybercore clearly violated reasonable employment practices and potentially their own contract terms. Their behavior regarding bereavement leave was particularly egregious. What should I expect from them now? I asked. They'll likely start with threats about intellectual property and unauthorized access, then move to settlement offers when they realize their position is weak. She closed her laptop. Are you ready for this meeting? I nodded. The worst had already happened. I had lost my father. Corporate intimidation held little power over me now. At 11 o'clock, we arrived at Cybercore headquarters. Richard Peterson had requested an urgent meeting which I had agreed to on the condition that my attorney would be present. We were escorted to the main conference room where Peterson sat with Marcus, Joanna, and 2 men I recognized as the company's legal counsel. Thank you for coming in, Brittany. Peterson began, his tone carefully neutral. And Miss Barnes, though, I had hoped we could resolve this matter informally. Given the circumstances of my client's departure, legal representation seemed prudent, Catherine replied smoothly. Marcus looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. Joanna maintained her professional mask, though her tightly gripped pen betrayed her tension. Let's address the immediate concern, Peterson continued. We need access to the Westfield systems and documentation immediately. The client has threatened to cancel their contract if we don't resolve the access issues by tomorrow. I looked directly at Marcus as I responded. That would be unfortunate considering how much effort I put into saving that account last month. The company acknowledges your contributions, Peterson said quickly, which is why we're prepared to offer you a consulting contract to assist with the transition. Very generous terms. Catherine opened her briefcase. Before discussing any arrangements, we need to address the circumstances of my client's resignation. I have documentation of a meeting in which Miss Johnson was explicitly told to choose between attending her father's funeral and maintaining her position with the company. She slid copies of my documented account across the table along with printouts of relevant emails. This represents a clear violation of basic employment standards and creates potential liability for constructive dismissal, emotional distress, and violation of contract terms regarding reasonable working conditions. The company lawyers exchanged glances as they reviewed the documents. There may have been a misunderstanding, Joanna offered weakly. Company policy allows for 2 days of bereavement leave, and given the critical timing of the Westfield project. A human resources professional told my client that attending her father's funeral could impact her standing in the company, Catherine interrupted. That goes well beyond enforcing policy. It's textbook workplace hostility. Marcus finally spoke. The Westfield deadline was immovable. We were trying to balance business necessities with personal circumstances. I leaned forward. You were asking me to work on the day I buried my father. The room fell silent. Even Peterson had the decency to look ashamed. What exactly are you seeking here? One of the company lawyers finally asked. Catherine and I had discussed this thoroughly. 3 things, I said. First, a comprehensive revision of Cybercore's bereavement and family leave policies, including a minimum of 5 paid days for immediate family and flexibility for exceptional circumstances. Peterson nodded reluctantly. That could be arranged. Second, a written acknowledgement that my treatment was inappropriate and confirmation that both Marcus Fleming and Joanna Perkins will receive proper training on compassionate employee relations. Marcus began to protest, but Peterson cut him off. Reasonable. What else? Third, fair compensation for my intellectual contributions to the company, particularly the proprietary algorithms I developed that CyberCore continues to market as a key product feature. This sparked more resistance. You developed those under company employment, the second lawyer argued. Standard IP clauses apply. Developed largely during unpaid overtime without proper compensation or credit, Catherine countered, producing more documentation. And while employed under conditions that we can now demonstrate were hostile and potentially illegal. What followed was 3 hours of detailed negotiation. The company attorneys fought hard, but their position weakened considerably when Catherine produced evidence of systemic, unpaid overtime, gender-based pay discrepancies, and documented instances of denied personal leave that violated both company policy and state labor laws. By mid-afternoon, we had reached an agreement. CyberCore would implement a new, more humane bereavement policy, officially named the Robert Johnson Family Leave Protocol in my father's honor. Marcus and Joanna would be required to complete comprehensive training on compassionate management practices, and I would receive a substantial settlement for my contributions, along with continued royalties for the algorithms I had developed. There's still the matter of the Westfield account, Peterson reminded me, as papers were being signed. We need those files and access immediately. I'll transfer everything once the agreement is executed, I promised, but I want something else added to the policy changes. What's that? Peterson asked warily. An annual company-wide day of service in my father's name, where employees can volunteer with organizations that support families dealing with sudden loss. Peterson seemed surprised by the request. That's actually a good idea. Community involvement would be positive for our image right now. The final agreement was signed by 5 o'clock. I provided the access information for the secure repository containing the Westfield files, along with detailed documentation to help the transition team. As a gesture of good faith, I also agreed to be available for limited phone consultation over the next 2 weeks, though I made it clear I would not be returning as an employee. As we prepared to leave, Peterson asked to speak with me privately for a moment. I want to apologize personally, he said once the others had left the room. I've been so focused on quarterly numbers that I lost sight of what makes a company actually function, the humans behind the code. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was, I agreed. He taught me that standing up for yourself doesn't mean tearing others down. It means establishing boundaries that allow everyone to maintain their dignity. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. The new policies we're implementing because of you will help a lot of families in the future. That's a significant legacy. Walking out of CyberCore for the final time, I felt no triumph or vindication, just a quiet certainty that I had honored my father's memory by ensuring that no other employee would have to choose between grieving a loved one and keeping Luda's, their job. The company would survive and possibly become more humane in the process. The systems I had built would continue to function. Life would go on. But something fundamental had changed, both in the company culture and in my own understanding of my worth, not just as an engineer, but as a human being. The months following my father's death and my departure from CyberCore were a time of profound transformation. Grief comes in waves, as anyone who has lost a loved one knows. Some days I could barely get out of bed, the absence of my father, and almost physical pain. Other days I found myself smiling at memories of him, grateful for the 32 years we had shared. My mother struggled more visibly. After 40 years of marriage, she had to learn how to exist in a world without her partner. I spent more time at her house, helping with practical matters and simply being present. In our shared grief, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Your father would be so proud of how you stood up for yourself, she told me one evening as we sorted through his belongings. He always said you had his backbone and twice his brains. 3 months after leaving CyberCore, I launched my own consulting firm, Johnson Digital Solutions. I was selective about clients, choosing to work with companies that demonstrated genuine respect for work-life balance and employee well-being. My reputation in the industry meant I could afford to be choosy, and soon I had built a small but thriving business based on principles my father would have approved of. One of my first major decisions was establishing the Robert Johnson Memorial Scholarship for underprivileged students pursuing computer science degrees. Funded by part of my settlement from CyberCore, the scholarship would help ensure that my father's love of technology continued to inspire future generations. Several of my former colleagues reached out after leaving Cybercore themselves. The company had implemented the promised policy changes, but the culture was slower to evolve. Marcus had been moved to a non-management position after multiple complaints surfaced following my departure. Joanna from HR had left the company entirely. Jason, my former backup, joined my consulting firm 6 months after I started it. Working at Cybercore after you left showed me how toxic it really was, he explained. I want to be part of something built on different values. Together we began developing a framework for ethical tech employment consulting, with companies looking to improve their workplace culture. What had begun as a personal stand against one instance of corporate cruelty had evolved into a mission to transform how tech companies treat their employees. The most unexpected development came 1 year after my departure, when Richard Peterson contacted me. He had left Cybercore to start his own venture, and wanted my insights on creating a company culture that valued employees as whole human beings. Your stand against our policies made me reevaluate everything about how I led the company, he admitted during our meeting. I realized I'd been perpetuating a system that burned through talented people without a second thought. I agreed to consult with him, not out of forgiveness, but because change has to start somewhere. If my experience could help prevent others from facing the same impossible choice I had, then sharing that wisdom seemed like the right thing to do. Processing grief, while building a new career, wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of loss would hit me unexpectedly, moments when I reached for my phone to call my dad, before remembering he wasn't there to answer. But gradually the sharp pain of grief softened into something more manageable, a bittersweet awareness that love doesn't end with death. The lessons from that difficult period have shaped every aspect of my life since. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That organizations are only as humane as the people leading them choose to be. That no job, no matter how important, is worth sacrificing your fundamental dignity. Most importantly, I learned that one person refusing to accept inhumane treatment can catalyze change that benefits many others. The Robert Johnson Family Leave Protocol at Cybercore has since been adopted by several other tech companies. What began as my personal stand became a small but significant shift in industry standards. My father once told me that the true measure of a life well lived is not what you accumulate, but what you stand for. In honoring his memory, I found my own voice and the courage to use it. I discovered that sometimes the most valuable thing we can take back isn't data or code worth millions, but our dignity and the courage to demand that we be treated as humans first, employees second. That's the true legacy my father left me, and it's worth more than any paycheck ever could be. Has work ever forced you to miss an important family event? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support more content that explores the human side of workplace challenges. Remember, standing up for your values isn't just good for you. It creates ripples that can change entire systems for the better. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you never have to choose between what matters most and what pays the bills.